So I'm imagining a situation in which your sort of the things that make you tick are different from other people's. And in fact, we can sort of talk about the idea I had in mind in a moment, because I remember you were asked on this video that I talked about. Somebody, I think in your chat or whatever, asked you what happens when one person's sort of base internal preferences contradict another person's. Because it's easy enough to say we're going to sort of enter into a transactional relationship where if we share our food, you're going to benefit, I'm going to benefit, it's all good. But if there's a situation in which you have a basic conflict, your interests versus somebody else's interests, what do you do when they contradict? And what you said at the time was a bad preference, and I'm quoting, a bad preference is one that demands other people to violate things that would satisfy their own preferences, in my opinion. There's like an incompatibility there. But I don't think I have any internal preferences that contradict other people's so radically. Or if they do, I would argue that I'm correct and they're incorrect, and fuck them. I wonder if that's still the approach that you would take to
I think so.
Value conflicts.
It sounds really harsh, but at some point it's going to become, it would turn into violent conflict, and it would be a destroying one side and a survival of the other. So if there were two civilizations that came into contact, and in one civilization, they thought that it was permissible, if you really felt like you really wanted to kill somebody, you ought to be able to call someone out in the street, just kill them. And in another society, they're like, we're not doing that. This might be such a fundamental disagreement, or the one civilization of people might be so altered such that this is such a high preference of theirs that they couldn't conceive of living in a world where they weren't allowed to fulfill that. But in that case, when you've got a conflicting, like two deeply conflicting values like that, it would have to come out in some sort of violent conflict, because there'd be no other way to resolve it. Now, for me,
would there be any? Sorry, carry on.
I was going to say, for me, I firmly believe that like 99% of humans, just because we all come from roughly the same genetic stock, I think we have roughly the same fundamental preferences. I don't think there are groups of people that have huge differences like that. Now, there might be some that come out through like socializing or cultural stuff. So like maybe people's opinions on like LGBT issues, but on really fundamental stuff like, should I be allowed to steal from you, rape you, kill you, attack you without provocation? I think for the most part, I think almost every like human being that is mentally sound and everything will agree on these things, I think.
That may be true on some sort of very basic assumptions, but I think people often overestimate the moral consensus that humanity has had throughout its history. Views about whether you're allowed to sort of kill people, I think have evolved. So, our views on sort of a nation's right to expand, or ownership of other human beings in situations of slavery. I don't think it's as obvious as perhaps you make it out to be. In other words, I think there can be these conflicts, but where there are these conflicts, and you say this would essentially evolve into violent conflict, do you think there's a sense in which you can say either side is right in that conflict? I mean, imagining, for example, some version of World War II where the fighting was based on some fundamental value conflict about what you're allowed to do to other human beings. Violent conflict. Is there a sense in which we can say that one side is correct there? Or do we just have to say that what we're witnessing is might makes right?
I feel like to say one side is correct, I feel like you would have to be able to ultimately resolve some moral statement down to some truth value. There would have to be some moral facts to speak of, and I'm kind of cocked. I don't really believe in stuff like that. So I wouldn't be able to say at the end of the day that like it's right to not want to enslave somebody, or it's right to not want to murder somebody. I don't know if I believe that any of those moral statements ultimately reduce to some fact of the matter. So no, I don't know if I could ever say there's a right or wrong side in any given conflict like that. There's just the values that I purport to have, and hopefully other people around me have them. And if some people are so incompatible and we can't find common grounds on it, then at some point it's probably going to come to some sort of violent conflict to resolve the difference. So and then through that, actually, hold on. There's so many statements I can already see getting clipped of me and fucking shipped out on the internet from stuff like this. So on the other side of this, the reason why I have an issue with this is because I personally have not found a way to resolve fundamental moral differences between two people. The problem being the incommensurality of people's moral systems, right? If some guy says, well, I read all of Kant, and another guy says, well, I read the entire Bible. Okay, well, it's like you've got a guy speaking a binary and a guy based, like there's just no, you're never, ever going to have any sort of like reasonable communication between those two people. So I think my biggest problem when people try to tell me, well, what about this? Don't you think this is right or this is wrong? When you come to people that have these like different moral systems built on what they believe are objectively true statements, because some of those objectively true statements are like axiomatic to them, I don't know how you resolve that difference with somebody else who might have some different, fundamentally different axiomatic statements that their moral system is built off of. That's the big problem that I have. So everything kind of becomes a little bit subjective to me. Yeah.
Have you tried belief in God?
Well, I mean, that works for God-fearing people, but then as soon as you run into somebody who's not, then you kind of, you have a whole issue there, you know?
That might solve some of your problems with your ability to rightfully assert your own morality. But
sure.
I guess like you're looking at a situation like World War II and saying, you know, the classic example, the classic sort of, and it is quite an emotive point against sort of ethical non-realism, is to say, how do we interpret this? So, because you still, I imagine, meaningfully use terms like good and bad in sort of everyday conversation, or like political debates and conversation. You say that this was the wrong thing to do, this was a bad thing, he should have done this, he shouldn't have done that. This kind of thing.
Yeah, all like highly contextual. But then like I would also say like I'm a hardline determinist too, but also like you need to make a better choice. And it's like, well, how do you believe in choice at all? Well, okay, well, within the context of what we're talking about, I'm using the word choice, right? But same thing with like good or bad. Like this is bad behavior, this is good behavior. If somebody were to challenge me, you know, like, oh, well, fundamentally, aren't you a moral subjectivist? I'd probably just shoot him in the face, right? Like there's no meaningful conversation. Yeah, but no, like I understand. I definitely know there's a desire to speak of like moral absolutes. Like it feels good. We want to be able to say like slavery is morally absolutely wrong, or murdering somebody, you know, killing somebody without provocation is absolutely morally wrong. But without having like a belief in actual reducible moral fact, I don't know how you can make those statements with that level of certainty.
Do you believe in the concept of moral progress?
Do
you think the world is better now than it was?
No, I understand.
200 years ago?
Like, I believe in moral progress, I guess, but like it's a subjective thing. Like, I mean, I'm a citizen of the world today, so I believe that, and I like the morals that exist today. So I believe there's probably been like some level of progress. But I don't know, if I would have been a person 1,000 years ago, maybe I would have felt like this was a moral regression, right? Or so
in the same way that we can sit here and say, well, you know, there was a time when people sort of hated homosexuals and thought that women should be confined to the home, and how crazy is that? Look at how much progress we've made. You know, in a close possible universe with the opposite trajectory, we could say, or, you know, if things revert in 100, 200 years time, we could be sat here saying, gosh, I mean, you know, just 100 years ago, people thought that women should be in the workplace and that homosexuals should be able to adopt children. How crazy and awful that was. And look how we've progressed. In other words, do you think that we have to, if we have a worldview similar to yours here, just abandon any ability to say that certain states of affairs are better and worse, rather than just saying, like, I prefer it? I mean, there seems to be a meaningful difference between me saying, I prefer a world in which homosexuals aren't persecuted, versus saying something like, I prefer my showers to be scalding hot rather than just warm. You know what I mean? That there seems to be we seem to be talking about a different kind of preference here. But if it is all just essentially whatever's going to sort of make me feel better about myself, there doesn't seem to be much of a difference between those kinds of preferences, right? Is that your view, that the preference that you have, that, you know, people not be racist, is similar to the preference that you have of what temperature your shower should be?
Yeah, I think ultimately at the end of the day, I think I would say it's all roughly the same thing. Yeah. And then I would have to say, in considering, I can't technically believe, if somebody would ask me if you believe in moral progress, I'd have to say no, because progress implies some objective movement from or towards something else, which implies there is some like moral goal or whatever. I can only say that like there's been progress insofar as I guess what I would like to see, but ultimately it would all be contextual and subjective. So yeah.
So how do you square that with? I mean, I'm not entirely familiar with what sort of you're most interested in right at this moment on a political level, but I imagine there are certain issues that you care deeply about, try to have debates about and make content about, with a view to trying to, you know, mobilize people into believing something that you believe, and saying probably things like, this is wrong, this is bad, this is good, this is what you should do. How do you square that sort of commonsensical language on the surface level when talking about how to behave, with the fact that a little bit of digging reveals that what you're essentially talking about is your favorite temperature of shower?
I think that the thing that I tried to appeal to is that even if these things are ultimately subjective, and even if I can't ground them out in some like resolute, concrete morality, these preferences are real, they're strong, and they're shared by almost everybody. So when I start to argue with people, even my rhetorical strategies are going to be pretty similar. If I'm arguing trans issues, for instance, with a conservative, I'm not usually going to argue that like, hey, don't you think it'd be good if we allowed, every single type of person in society to have access to the same rights and privileges? Because you're nebulous, negative, positive rights, you're in some weird world. I usually do like a direct appeal to, hey, you're a parent. If your child had a medical problem and you had a conversation with your child and your doctor, would you want the government getting in between you and your doctor and making a good decision for your child, right? So even rhetorically, I try ultimately at the end of the day to appeal to people's like individual preferences and to try to demonstrate, like when I'm trying to tell you, when I'm arguing with somebody and I say, I think what you're doing is wrong, that's the verbiage that comes out. But what I'm really saying, and what we'll get at in the conversation is, hey, the thing that you're advocating for, I don't think you realize is ultimately contrary to your own self-interests. That's essentially what I end up arguing with people. Yeah.
That's more or less the approach that I've taken as well. You're essentially running a consistency test rather than trying to establish some base moral principles from which you sort of build up to truth.
The thing I think is important to realize, the only reason why that consistency test works is because we have some shared, I hate that I lean into this so much, but some shared like moral intuition, right? Which is a phrase that I hated 3 years ago because I was like, we're gonna find the ultimate moral blah. But now I lean strongly on these moral intuitions. But this system breaks if you run into the occasional, fucking psychopath, right? If you start running into somebody who's like, I don't care if somebody tries to kill me, I actually would want to live in a world where we all fight to the death. And it's like, okay, well, you're insane and there is no arguing with you. I can't appeal to your preferences because your preferences are so out of line with 99% of humanity. But that's essentially my rhetorical, and I guess like
in which case, might makes right. When you come up with a genuine value conflict, it's just whoever's got the bigger guns wins out. And and that's kind of how it. I don't want to say should be because that's to import moral language, but it's not how it shouldn't be.